Well, good evening. Vacation Bible School this morning and Rejebian this evening. It must be summer. Well, welcome. We're delighted that you're here. I'm John Fiedler, one of the many ministers on staff here at Highland Park United Methodist Church. And of course, we're very proud of the Rejebian series. And I'm going to introduce Richard Stanford in a minute, who does such a great job. He's the godfather of the literary circles around here, and Richard will introduce our speaker. But in the meantime, we just want to welcome you, and we're delighted that you're here. And this is the beginning of this marvelous Rejebian series. And of course, we're very grateful to Jane and the entire Rejebian family on making this possible. But as is our tradition here at Highland Park United Methodist Church, we will begin with the prayers. So let us pray, please. Lord, we ask your blessing as we begin another summer of the Rejebian series. We thank you for this opportunity to come together for food and fellowship, for thoughtful writers and compelling books, for words that inspire us and increase our awareness of the human condition. And this evening, we thank you for the human drama that is the state of Texas as we hear other voices and celebrate new perspectives. We pray this in the name of Christ Jesus. Amen. And now, how about a Highland Park welcome to Richard Stanford. Richard, thanks for all you do.
This book is a page turner and it's an eye opener. You know, a lot of us who grew up in Texas grew up on a kind of an Anglo-victorious narrative that just edited out the complexity and the diversity of Texas history. More and more of that's been coming out recently, but Sam Haynes' new book, Unsettled Land, really brings that out. I don't know anything about Chief Bowles and the Cherokee. I don't know about Goyans and Free Blacks and Nacogdoches and I've heard of the Seguins, but did you ever get taught much about the Seguins or Lorenzo de Zavala? You know, such a prominent person. It just kind of got edited out. So this is important new history. Now, I don't know. I haven't seen David. Are you here, David Hill? Maybe not. David Hill is the education director of the Dallas Historical Society, and I don't know whether Roy Washburn's here or not, the chair of the trustees, but you know, we have a treasure in our midst in the Hall of State, one of the great shrines of Texas history, together with Washington on the Brazos and the Bullock Museum. Because it says Dallas, we think it's just Dallas. Oh, it's the Texas Revolution. David's here because he's interested in Sam's new book because it is so eye-opening. So anyway, there are going to be books for sale upstairs. You've already seen in Terabang, which is the largest independent bookseller in Dallas. Brian Weiskopf, who's there. Yay for them. Brian, as their manager, is up selling books. After this program, books are for sale. We only ordered about 100, and about 30% of them are already gone. So get up there if you want one. And then Sam Haynes will sign. There'll be a book signing right after he gets up there. So really, Sam Haynes is a professor of history, as you might guess, director of the Greater Southwest Studies at UTA, and I'm trying to think of all the awards he's won for this. Well, Foreign Affairs called it one of the best books of 2022. The Texas Institute of Letters and the Texas Historical Commission have given it awards as really one of the best books on Texas history in recent times. And so this is a great night to relearn real Texas history from the guy who has given us the gift of real insight into the diversity and complexity of Texas. Please welcome Sam Haynes.
Aubrey, am I on? I am on. You guys can hear me? Okay. So I thought what I would do is talk for about 45 minutes and then open it up to questions. But apparently, if you have questions, you have to be on the ground floor. And Richard will come around. Okay? I want to thank Richard for inviting me. Thank the Rejebian family as well. And thank you all for coming. I'm sort of gobsmacked by the size of this crowd, I'll be honest with you. I give talks at book clubs all the time, and I'm lucky if there's 20 or 30 people there. And so this is a new experience for me, okay? So what I want to do, and let me make sure that, I'm sorry, let me test out the, no. Aubrey gave me a primer on this, and I've already forgotten what she said. No. Well, while we're dealing with the technical issues, okay. While we're getting this set up. Oh, here we go. And so, what do I do? There, got it. What I want to do first, before I go into the book at all, I want to tell you what the book is not about. I think that's fair. It's not a book about the Alamo. And if you've come tonight thinking, I am going to be talking about the Alamo, you're forewarned, okay? I hope I haven't lost anybody right away. But, of course, you all remember your 7th grade Texas history, I think, or you had kids that had to take 7th grade history, and you visited the Alamo. You know something, I'm going to assume that you know something about Texas history already. And, you know, it's a narrative that we have told again and again and again, exactly the same way, for generation after generation. It's really a calcified narrative. I can't think of any period in American history that you can say that's true of. It just hasn't changed. And there are lots of reasons why it hasn't changed, but I guess the most important reason, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, the most important reason is that for about a century or more, all historians were white men. And they told a story that privileged white men. And that can't be much of a surprise. And you know the story that I'm talking about. It's a story that features Sam Houston, David Crockett, Stephen F. Austin, Jim Bowie, William Bear Travis, and so on. And I'm not going to tell you that they don't factor into my book, because they do. But I want to tell a very, very different story, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But it's not just Texans who are fixated on the Alamo. Americans are. And in fact, you know, around the world that's true. If you know Phil Collins and the collection that Phil Collins of Genesis fame, who gave his collection to the Alamo, you know that this is sort of a global phenomenon. When I pitched the book to Basic in New York, my pitch basically was, there's a lot more to the 1830s in Texas than a 13-day siege in San Antonio. And my editor said, great, we love that idea. We did not know that. Write that book. So I did. I worked on it for about 3 years. And while we were in the editing process, I got an email from the art department, and they said, here's your cover art. We hope you like it. And I clicked on the PDF, and to my horror, there was a picture of the Alamo with smoke rising from the walls. And I said, no, this just won't do. And I really shouldn't make fun of the Basic art department, because I love the cover that the second attempt, but the first one was false advertising, if anything, because it's a 400-page book. It's a long book. I sent it to my son, and he said it was okay, but it needed more emojis. He hates it when I tell that story. But it's about 400 pages, and I have 4 pages on the Alamo, and that seems about right to me. Now, it's not just about the Texas Revolution. I don't start at Gonzales and end at San Jacinto. I go into the 1820s, 1830s. I cover the Republic and statehood period. So I'm covering a lot in 400 pages. But it's not a book about, it's not a military history of the Texas Revolution, the kinds of books that you are probably familiar with. So what is the book about? Well, the book is about a multi-ethnic world and really what is one of the most diverse regions in North America in the 19th century, just astonishingly diverse. Anglo-Americans represent about half the population when the revolution breaks out. They are in the minority throughout the 20s and the 30s, and yet we still tell these stories about Anglo-American settlers, and to the exclusion of everybody else. So, how diverse was it? I know I shouldn't feel the need to give you a primer on Texas history, but very, very briefly, because it's so important to the thesis of the book, there are a lot of different people here. Think of Texas as a place of convergence. Now, there's an indigenous population, but it's really quite small. You have the Karankawas along the coast, and you have some Coealtecan bands in central Texas, some Caddos who had been decimated by disease. But in the 1700s, that begins to change, and Texas undergoes what you might want to call a population boomlet. The Spanish arrive, establish a mission system. Then you begin to see nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes coming down from the west, the far west and the Midwest, the Apaches and the Comanches and the Wichitas. In the 1800s, it begins to change again with immigrant tribes from the United States, about whom I will be talking about in just a minute. The Cherokees, Chief Bowles, Richard talked about. Of course, we have Anglo-Americans, and they bring an enslaved population with them. But even the enslaved population is more diverse than you might think. And the reason is because the price of cotton had exploded in the mid-1830s, and to increase the acreage they put into cultivation, a lot of planters turned to a smuggling trade, buying slaves that were smuggled in from Cuba. And by the outbreak of the revolution, maybe half of the enslaved people in the Brazos River Valley, which is where all the planting was going on, cotton and sugar, about half that population is composed of Yoruba-speaking Africans. These were people who didn't even speak Spanish. They hadn't been in Havana long enough. They had only recently endured the horrors of the Middle Passage and were bought in Havana, slave markets in Havana, and shipped into Texas. These people could not communicate with the African-American population, or with the Anglo-American population, obviously. And then, of course, you have a Central European population coming in the 1820s and the 1830s. Sure, I'm leaving people out. But think of Texas in the early decades of the 19th century as this place of convergence that is attracting people from all over the continent and indeed the world. And so what I wanted to do then was tell a multi-ethnic story with all its complexity and all its many moving parts. So to begin, I want to give you 3 examples of how adopting a wide lens helps us to look at these events very, very differently. If there's a takeaway to my talk tonight, if somebody asks you when you get home, so how was that book talk and what did he say? You should say this. It's not a question of simply taking people of color and inserting them into that traditional narrative. What you really need to do is look at these people separate and apart from the Anglo experience, and then to weave those different stories together for a different narrative. And what I found, and to be honest, even I was surprised at the extent to which that narrative changed. So is this a revisionist treatment of the Texas Revolution in the early 19th century? Well, I suppose, but what I really wanted to do was, and what made it so much fun, was to say, all right, that narrative, that traditional narrative that you know and that I know, that you were taught as kids, that narrative was fine for the 20th century. But let's start again and let's write it again, and with all of these people, and tell about all of their stories, and see what kind of narrative we have. And I think you'll find, if you read the book, that it's a very, very different narrative than the traditional one. Okay, so the first example of this need to adopt a wide lens, hopefully got there we go. We'll start in the 1820s. We'll start with Stephen F. Austin, because if you remember your Texas history, and how could you forget? When we get to the Mexican Republic, it's Stephen F. Austin and the Old 300 all the time. We build statues to this guy. We've named our state capital after this guy. And I'm not going to stand here and say he's not important. But I do want you to remember this. The first Americans to come to Texas in the 19th century are not Anglo-Americans. They're Native Americans. They're Native American refugees from the United States. And they start coming in the early 1800s, and they're coming in the 20s and in the 30s. Here's a picture of Chief Bowles. Sometimes you'll see Chief Bowles mentioned in traditional books, but we don't give him his due. But he's a Cherokee leader. I'll say a little bit more about him in a minute. But I thought it would be helpful, and again, I just want to give you a little bit of background here. In case you don't know, what are these people doing here? Because these are not Comanches, these are not nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples. These are people from the United States. Now, maybe you know about the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is in 1839. This is many years earlier, and they begin to come in dribs and drabs. There's no pointer on my thing, so if you just look at East Texas, don't worry about the rest of the state. You'll see that just below the Red River, there are Shawnees and Delawares who would come down from the Midwest. To the south, around the Piney Woods, you see the Cherokees, Choctaws. There are Chickasaws too, but we couldn't fit them in. You go farther south, there are Cushatas and Alabamas. To the northwest, you'll see the Kickapoos in that area around Corsicana and a little bit to the east. All of these people had come into Texas in the early decades of the 19th century, and they were there in larger numbers than Anglo-Americans, at least initially. Now, what had happened was they were ceding their land to federal and state governments, and the federal government made very little provision for what they should do next. This is, again, nothing like the forced relocation of Native Americans in the Trail of Tears. They signed their treaties, and they were pretty much on their own. And they were told that land had been set aside for them in Arkansas and then Oklahoma, and off they went. And sometimes they got to to Indian territory, and for a whole series of reasons, various reasons for each tribe, things didn't work out, they weren't happy, and they just drifted across the Red River because there was really no one there to stop them. And there were some Indian tribes that don't even go to Indian territory at all. They cede their land to these federal and state authorities, and they just go west, and they cross the Sabine, the boundary between Louisiana and Texas, and they build villages in the Piney Woods. So there is this vibrant population of Native American groups. And if you have a Texas history book handy at home, take a look and see how much attention these people get. I got interested in Texas history teaching 7th grade in another life. It was in the 80s. And I realized that I loved Texas history. I just wasn't too keen on teaching 7th graders. So anyway, that's why I decided to focus on the Texas Republic. And I still have that book that we used at a school I taught at in Houston. And I have looked at and done a careful study of some of the books that are used today, and they have barely changed. So we need to look at the Native American population in the early decades of the 19th century. They need to be a part of this story. And so I want to focus on one guy, and I'm sorry, I'm still on my first example. I want to focus on one guy, and I don't have a picture of him, and we know very little about him, but he's clearly important. And he is an associate of Chief Bowles, who I showed you a minute ago, and his name is Richard Fields. And Richard Fields is an astonishing figure. He is a mixed-race Cherokee, and unlike Bowles, and unlike a lot of Cherokees, and perhaps because he was mixed-race, but he'd speculated in land in Tennessee, and then he'd speculated in land in Arkansas before he got to Texas. And he understood in ways that Native Americans like Bowles, who was much older than he was, more of a traditionalist, did not understand, and that was, we are squatters here. We do not have title to the land that we occupy. Cherokees were between the Angelina and the Neches River, if you know your East Texas geography. And Fields thought it was very, very important that they get a secure title, an official agreement from the Mexican government. So in the early 20s, he goes down to Mexico City with Bowles. And Stephen F. Austin's there. And so are all these other impresarios who are trying to get land grants from the Mexican government. And while the Mexican government was handing out land grants to white impresarios, it wasn't all that keen on giving a land grant to the Cherokees. And the reasons are complex, but I think the most important reason is the Cherokees were penniless. And to be an impresario, to be a colonist like Stephen F. Austin, took a lot of money. You had to have deep pockets, which they did not have. So the Mexican government in 1824 sends Fields and Bowles packing. It doesn't really tell them no, but it doesn't really tell them yes either. It just says, we will get back to you. While it's, of course, handing out land grants hand over fist to American impresarios. And Fields goes back and he does something unbelievable and inexplicable, because I can't explain it. I'm just going to give you my best hypothesis. He goes back to Cherokee country and he says to the people in his village and elsewhere, that could not have gone better. They've given us secure title to the land we are on. And more than that, I get to go into Oklahoma and recruit new Native American migrants into East Texas. Nothing about this was true. And so for a year, he kind of disappears. And then we get this hilarious letter that he writes to Mexican officials in Nacogdoches. And it's, I am Richard Fields. I am the superior chief of the Indians. I am the leader of all of these people, and I would like to negotiate. And they are very concerned because they've never heard of this guy, and they write to Mexico City, and they say, have you heard of Richard Fields? He says he's the superior chief of the Indians. And they say, that was the guy we sent packing a year ago. And it is a real concern for the Mexican government. And it's a real concern for the U.S. government, and I don't have time to go into that. But the U.S. government was hoping to buy East Texas, the land on which these people occupied. And it did not want to buy land that was occupied by thousands and thousands of refugees from the United States. So it's a concern for Mexico, it's a concern for the United States. It creates something of a diplomatic incident. And ultimately, Fields is unsatisfied, and he will try to lead a revolt in 1826-27 with some other disgruntled Anglo-Americans. But in his mind, it's going to be a pan-Indian uprising aided and abetted by Anglo settlers. It fails spectacularly. But the demand, the Cherokees' demand for a secure title to the land they occupy continues. And year after year after year goes by, and it's one of the more poignant stories of the book. Their frustrated efforts to get the Mexican government and then the Texas Republic government interested in permanent title. but I don't have time to go into that. All I'll say is, I get it. I understand. Stephen F. Austin is the headline here. Stephen F. Austin, we don't have the birth of early modern Texas without Stephen F. Austin. But we need to talk about Austin in conjunction with this, what is for several years a much larger Native American population in East Texas. And they need to be part of this story, and to be perfectly honest, they've been completely written out of it. Okay. So that's the 1820s. My second example will deal with the revolution itself. And Richard mentioned Lorenzo de Zavala, and maybe you've heard of Lorenzo de Zavala. But in most Texas books, Texas history books, what you get about Zavala is always the same. He is a liberal Federalist, an intellectual from the Yucatan, and for some reason he shows up in Texas, and he is an ally of Stephen F. Austin, and he works for on behalf of the Anglo-revolutionaries, and he is tapped to be the vice president of the Texas Republic during the interim Texas government. And so he's vice president for a few months, signs the Declaration of Independence. And that's it. That's all we get about Lorenzo de Zavala. Why is he there? What is he doing in Texas in the summer of 1835? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Lorenzo de Zavala had figured out before, like Richard Fields, Zavala had figured out before anyone else that he was associated with that a lot of money could be made in land speculation. But that could only happen if Anglo-American migration was allowed to continue. So he had hitched his star to the Americans very early on. But I don't want to talk about his land speculative activities because I'm trying to keep you interested, and it's pretty boring. I thought I would talk about his relationship with this man, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who you undoubtedly know, or think you know. And a lot of people, again, Santa Anna has not been well treated by history, and particularly by Texas historians, not surprisingly. But even Mexican historians have had a hard time figuring him out. He's a very enigmatic figure. And in my book, I kind of characterize him as a lot like Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, if you know anything about Jackson, he was a war hero. He was a backwoods general. But he really didn't think in ideological terms the way his contemporaries did, like Clay or Calhoun or Webster. Santa Anna is exactly the same way. Backwoods general, war hero, hero of Tampico in 1829. But he's not like these intellectuals in Mexico, like Zavala or Bustamante or Alemán. He doesn't think in those terms. If you want to understand Santa Anna, if you want to understand Jackson, this is all you need to know. Who are their friends and enemies at any given moment? They personalize politics in ways that their contemporaries did not. So this relationship's really important. I don't want to go into the weeds of Mexican politics, but I will say this. This is a Mexican story before it becomes an American one. And so you cannot understand this story if you don't know something about Mexican politics. I will allow you to do your own research later on this subject because it's pretty Byzantine, to be honest, but I'll just say this. This relationship was very close and amicable for a while, and then it was very bitter and rancorous for a while. Zavala and Santa Anna together conspire to overthrow the presidential election results in 1828. And so they're allies in the next administration. And then they have a falling out. And Zavala will be in exile in New York in 1830. And in the early 30s, he has friends in Mexico City who will pave the way for a reconciliation. Try to get Santa Anna to allow him to come back from exile. And Santa Anna agrees, and they become fast friends again. And then then Zavala is sent to Paris. He is the Mexican minister to France in 1834, and that is when Santa Anna abolishes the Constitution of 1824, the Constitution they had passed a decade earlier. And Zavala was a liberal federalist, and he was furious by what he read in the papers and furious by what he was learning from his friends back home. And so he writes to the Mexican government, and he says, it's a very tactful letter, and he said, nothing for me to do here. I cannot represent this government. I resign. But he also writes that same day a letter, we would call it an op-ed, to a newspaper in Mexico City, and he blasts Santa Anna, and he writes this excoriating attack on what he has done. You have torn the Constitution to pieces, he says. He's burned every bridge that he could possibly have, and he's immediately recalled, told to come home. And he knows he's not doing that. He said, thank you, I won't come home. I won't go back to Mexico City, but this is what I will do. I will go to Texas, and I will take up the life of a country squire. I bought some land there, and I'm just going to retire from politics. Nobody believed that in Mexico City, least of all Santa Anna, and with good reason. Zavala was a political animal, and he sails from France to New Orleans, and he meets with Mexican exiles there. And there they plot sort of the broad outlines of a coup. And Zavala's role is to make Texas a beachhead of opposition to the Sandinista regime. And so in the summer of 35, he makes landfall in Texas. This is the most famous and well-known opponent of Santa Anna's regime. That's who has landed in Texas, thinking that he will now spearhead a revolution. And he doesn't really get the reception that he expects. Stephen F. Austin knew him and was quite cordial, and they did work together. But most Anglo-Americans didn't have the faintest idea who he was, and they really didn't want to have anything to do with it. So he does not lead this revolt as he had hoped. But it doesn't matter, because in Mexico, they knew he had made landfall. And these letters, the military governor, military commander in San Antonio, learns that Zavala has arrived, and he writes to the authorities in Saltillo, and they write to Mexico City, and they write to Santa Anna and his hacienda. Zavala is here. And that's why the Mexican government begins to think about authorizing a campaign into Texas. Now, again, look at traditional histories. We've always been told, and I thought before I started writing the book, I lectured this way for years, that, that campaign, which lays siege to the Alamo and ends in disaster at San Jacinto, that campaign is authorized because of what Anglo-Americans are doing. And the more I began to look at it, the more I realized that makes absolutely no sense at all. It's not as if the Mexican army was waiting for a green light to march north, because the Mexican government was in complete disarray. It was bankrupt. It required 2 loans just to get money to make this campaign a reality. And even that money wasn't enough. They sort of ran out of funds by the time they got to the river and started stiffing vendors along the way. But that took a long time. They had to conscript men into the Mexican army. That took a while. They had to train them. That took a while. And so this campaign has been authorized in the fall of 35, before Anglo-Americans have really figured out what's happening, before they decide what course of action they are going to take. This was a major undertaking. This was the largest campaign the Mexican army had ever seen. And not only that, but Santa Anna decides to lead that campaign himself. This is the president of Mexico leading a campaign hundreds and hundreds of miles from the capital. And why is he doing that? Well, the answer is pretty clear. He wants to bring Zavala back home in chains. Zavala is now his arch nemesis. Now, as I said, things don't actually work out the way Zavala had hoped, and he wasn't really in charge. And, as the months went by, Santa Anna realized that was actually true, and that, in fact, this was going to be an Anglo-American revolt, not just by colonists, but by thousands of volunteers who were coming in from New Orleans and elsewhere in the Deep South to aid in the cause. So the revolution, the revolt had changed its shape, and so the campaign was not called off just because Zavala wasn't in charge. And off they went. And it had now taken on sort of a new character, but Zavala was never far from Santa Anna's mind. He goes to San Antonio, lays siege to the Alamo, we all know this story, and then he, Santa Anna, heads east to the Brazos River, where Houston's army is waiting to the north. And he gets, it's the rainy season, the Brazos is about a mile wide, takes forever to get across, and Santa Anna, gets across before anybody else, and he's part of that early contingent that makes it to the east side of the river. And he learned something he didn't know before, and that was that Sam Houston to the north knew that already. But the new government, which is Zavala and Burnett, are heading east, and they're about a day's march away in Harrisburg. So what does Santa Anna do? Off he goes with about a quarter of the army in search of Zavala. And for several days, Sam Houston doesn't even understand what he's done. Thinks it's a ruse to sort of outflank him. But then it becomes apparent that Santa Anna has other ideas, and rather than engage the Texas Army on the banks of the Brazos, he's going to go to Harrisburg and capture the government. Once again, none of these decisions make sense if you don't understand the relationship with Zavala. And so I want to speak to those people in the room who are still sort of diehard traditionalists. Okay, if I haven't made the sale yet, let me try this. If you're a traditionalist, you would want to know, why does that Mexican army get there in the third week of February? Because it was supposed to get there in the spring. And some people said, no, it won't even be, it'll be in the summer. It'll take that long. No, Mexican army shows up in the third week of February because it has been planning this and organizing it for months. If you're a traditionalist, you'd want to know that. If you're a traditionalist, you'd want to know, what is the president of Mexico doing leading this campaign? And most importantly, if you're a traditionalist, you would want to know, what on earth was the Santa Anna thinking when he took 25% of his army and headed east to what we now know was complete disaster at San Jacinto? You cannot understand the revolution without understanding the role that Lorenzo de Zavala plays. And yet, we've ignored him. And if you don't believe me, then I'm going to draw your attention to Exhibit A. I don't have Exhibit B, so this had better work. Okay, 1974, John Jenkins, who's a great historian, I'm not knocking John Jenkins. John Jenkins published this magisterial collection of papers of the Texas Revolution. It's 10 volumes. It's called The Papers of the Texas Revolution, John H. Jenkins, if you want to look it up. And if you're a Texas historian and you're writing about this period, you have to use Jenkins. There's no other choice. It's not complete. He didn't have access to Mexican archives, but he did his best. And in the 70s, he published this extraordinary collection, which is now online. If you go to volume 10, which is the index, and you look at, I think, the last page, this is what you see. Zavala Lorenzo Day. And by the way, if you've ever done any research, this is what I always tell my students, you don't start on page 1. What do? You go to the index and look to see if there's anything you need. So if you wanted to do research on Sam Houston, you would turn to the letter H And all the letters he wrote would be itemized in the index, and all the letters he received would be itemized, and all the letters that refer to him would be itemized. And the same thing with everybody else. Crockett, Travis Bowie, and so on. Zavala, Lorenzo Day, last page. And already there's a problem because Zavala is never spelt with two L's. There is a town in East Texas called Zavala, but they misspelled it too. I don't know what to tell you. Zavala only used one L. That's what it says. Too numerous to list. And if you've ever done research, then you are gobsmacked. I know that I was, because I was beginning to get interested in Zavala, and the papers, Jenkins' papers will tell me everything I need to know. And I mean, we're talking thousands of pages. It's 10 volumes, huge volumes. And you know what? This tells you a lot. There's a lot of correspondence about Zavala, but he can't be bothered to tell you where it is. And I spoke to a friend of mine who's a Texas historian, and I said, do you believe this? What gives? And he thought about it for a minute. He said, all right, so Zavala's name begins with the letter Z, and Jenkins had been working on this book, on this set for years. And so maybe he just said, oh, to heck with it, and I'm shipping this thing off to the publisher. And I thought, okay, so that makes a weird kind of sense. But if the father of Texas, if his letter did not begin with A, but Z, all of his letters would be itemized in the index. And if the hero of San Jacinto, if his name began with the letter Z, you get the idea. Zavala just wasn't considered important enough by John H. Jenkins. And so what does that tell us? I mean, how could we have gotten this so wrong? How many books do you think have been written on the Texas Revolution? I've never done a count, but I'm guessing 100 or more. Hundreds, perhaps. Scores, certainly. And we don't talk about this guy. And why don't we talk about him? I'm afraid to say the answer goes back to what I said at the very, very beginning. The Texas Revolutionary story was written by Anglo-Americans, and they made the story all about us. And it's important to remember, and I just think it's undeniable, that the Texas Revolution starts off as a Mexican story. That's why Zavala is so important. But it morphs into an American one very, very quickly once the shooting starts. So we really do need to take Zavala into account. We cannot study the Revolution without him. Okay, I'm looking at my time. I think I've got enough time to do the third one. Oh, and I'm going to have to make this quick because I promised there would be Q&A. So about half my book is the Revolution, and the other half is the Texas Republic. And if you've read any books on the Texas Revolution, I'm guessing it ends on the last page with Sam Houston on a white Charger at San Jacinto. It ends with a blast of trumpets and a crash of cymbals. And that's the Texas Revolution. It's all we need to know. And that was not the book that I wanted to write, because I wanted to write about what comes afterwards. What kind of country have they created? If you can look at that, then you know a lot more about their motivations. And so, very, very quickly, I hope I'm not getting into the weeds here and giving you sort of inside baseball history stuff, but there was a great historian, a mentor to so many of us at SMU, David Weber. And David Weber said about the Texas Revolution, I don't know this is a revolution at all. It just looks like more of American Manifest Destiny to me, just Americans expanding, moving inexorably across the continent. And he didn't like the term Texas Revolution, and a lot of us followed suit, me included. But the more I thought about it, and I really just thought about it for this book, that we need to look at the Republic too, so that we can understand the Revolution. And I came to the conclusion that, it is a revolution. I call it all kinds of things in the book: secessionist movement, a revolt, a rebellion, a war for independence. But by the end of it, I really came to the conclusion that, yes, it is a revolution. It does result in a major political and social upheaval. This isn't just Texas braggadocio calling it the Texas Revolution. But the only way that makes sense is to carry that narrative forward and to see what happens. And I'm really running out of time, so I'll make it very, very quick. The Texas Constitution is this astonishingly progressive document for its time. If you know anything about American history, then you know that in the 1820s, for the very first time, we begin to see universal white male suffrage, something the Founding Fathers had never envisioned. The 18th century, a culture of deference prevailed. That changes in the 20s and 30s. And the Texas Constitution is really sort of Jacksonian democracy on steroids, and for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the founders, the guys who wrote this document in March of 36, were really concerned about and alarmed by, wanted to prevent, the concentration of political and economic power. And so they put in all kinds of features to prevent that. And some of those things were, there was a free, land was set aside for public schools, so everybody could get an education. There was debtor relief. You couldn't have your home seized. You couldn't go to jail for debt. There was, but the most important thing of all was a land giveaway for anybody. If you were a citizen who lived in Texas at the time of the Revolution, and more if you fought, or if you just showed up on a muster roll, you got more acreage than that. 4,600 acres. It was this economic bonanza to everybody who was a citizen. But this is a country with a very narrow definition of citizenship. And if you're going to give land to every family, head of household in Texas, if you're going to set aside land for schools, that land's got to come from somewhere, and that land will come from the Native Americans who occupy it, who may not have had legal title, but who had been there for decades or generations, and almost all of them before Anglo-Americans arrived. And so, again, if we want to look at the Texas Revolution, we want to make sense of that, we need to look at the Republic, and not just what it means for whites, and I think it's a remarkable story in and of itself, but also what it means for everybody else. Because the revolution ends in 36, and by 39, all of the Native American groups that I talked about 5 minutes ago, they're gone. The only people left are the Alabama Coushatta, and you may be familiar with the reservation down in southeast Texas, and they occupied land that wasn't suitable for commercial agriculture. So they stayed. But everybody else on that map, the immigrant tribes, Shawnees, Delawares, Cherokees, and so on, they were all expelled, and brutally so, more so than what we see in the Trail of Tears, by 1839. What about Tejanos? Very, very quickly, you may have heard that Tejanos supported the revolt, and there's some truth to that. But the real story is this. When the shooting begins in the fall of 35, a lot of Tejanos support the rebellion. And that support diminishes quickly over time when they realize that maybe this isn't something they want. Maybe this is a revolt for independence and not for autonomy within the Mexican Republic. So by the time you get to San Jacinto, there's 24 men under the command of Juan Seguin, fighting alongside Sam Houston. But all the support has fallen off. There were other Tejanos who were not just ambivalent, but who actively fought against the revolt. You know who James Walker Fannin is? Perhaps the largest Tejano army to take the field is a group of partisans under Carlos de la Garza, who we definitely don't talk about. And Juan Seguin, supported the revolt, but I can tell you this, he wished he hadn't, because by 42, he's forced into exile and flees San Antonio just ahead of a lynch mob. It's a very dispiriting story for Tejanos. Now, the world for the enslaved doesn't change very much. That's certainly true, but Richard mentioned a man who I doubt anyone in the room knows, William Goyens, who was a free person of color. And I became fascinated by William Goyens because William Goyens was a a property owner, a businessman during the Mexican period. He had an inn, he had a grist mill, he had a sawmill, he speculated in land, he defended himself in court, he could vote, he campaigned, not for him, he did not run himself, but campaigned for others. His world changes the day the smoke clears at San Jacinto, because he's no longer a citizen, because he can't do any of the things that I just mentioned. And so the lives of people of color are really upended by this seismic shift to white rule, and that was something that I wanted to talk about in the book as well. All right, I'm running out of time, so I'll just close with this. Those are my three examples. One dealt with the 20s, one dealt with the Revolution, one dealt with the Republic period. And I just want to say this. Quickly, I was talking to a San Antonio businessman who was starting the book, and he liked it, but he said, you know what, I really do kind of miss the gripping yarns of the traditional narrative. And I said, okay, I guess that makes sense, but I'm not really an entertainer. And the more I thought about it, I was very tactful because, he did like the book. I would have been tactful anyway. But I thought about it a lot in the weeks since, and I thought, I get it. I get that, we are asking traditionalists to give up something. But we're getting a lot more as well. I think the story between Zavala and Santa Anna is a remarkable one. And it doesn't end there, by the way, because, spoiler alert, Santa Anna does not bring Zavala back in chains to Mexico City. In fact, Zavala shows up on the battlefield 2 days later. And the next chapter of that friendship, that relationship, is a really fascinating one. Richard Fields, who I talked about earlier in my talk, if you've read your Joseph Conrad, it's really it's a story it's not unlike Heart of Darkness. It doesn't end well for Colonel Kurtz, and it didn't end well for Richard Fields. But my point simply is that these are great stories in and of themselves, and we have missed them by taking this laser-like focus on Anglo-American actors. So what we get, I think, is, in many ways, certainly a broader cast of characters, that's true, but also a richer story as well. Thanks. I'm a little bit late.
We got time for maybe two questions.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Anybody, well, if nobody has a question, I got a question. Sure. Where's one? Okay. Charlie. Yes, Charlie will have a question.
What do you attribute to the fact that the races got along so bad and it turned out so bad later?
I'm sorry, the what?
On the races, how they got together and how slaves and everybody were treated? How it started off more benign and then turned terrible? What do you attribute that to?
Well, I don't want to argue that, and I'm not doing this today, and I was rushed for time, and I did mean to say, I'm not saying Mexico was a colorblind society. It wasn't. There was a caste system, but it was certainly a country which granted citizenship to non-whites. And even when it didn't grant citizenship, wasn't so sure about the immigrant tribes, they never would have removed them. If the Texas Revolution had never occurred, those immigrant tribes would still be here today. Absolutely no doubt about that at all. And so in the Jacksonian period, what happens is, and this is the great irony of the Jacksonian era, and it's this, that American democracy begins in the Jacksonian period. But it's a democracy for, quite unabashedly, white males. And that democracy, those rights have to come at the expense of others. So if you're going to create an agricultural society, and it was in the early 19th century, that land is going to be taken from Native Americans. And that labor is going to be almost exclusively African Americans. So that's the great irony of the Jacksonian period, and I'll be perfectly honest, that's what drew me to studying the period, making my career, studying the Jacksonian era. Because it's the seedbed of American democracy, but it comes at a cost for others, and we have to acknowledge that.
Okay, Sam, we got one back here.
After the Revolution, did Texas become a very popular place to come to, and then did it become disinterested with the Comanches, the way they were running around the state of Texas murdering the pioneers.
Well, okay. Can I address the second part of that question? I tried to take a different tack on the Comanches, and what I try to say is, and they are a raiding culture, and so I want to make that clear right off the top. But I would say this, that they did have a peace policy, and that was that they wanted Anglos off the Edwards Plateau, and they made that. They asked for that diplomatically in 37, and then in 40, and then in the 40s several times. And when in the U.S. during the U.S. period that follows, the Comanches always wanted the same thing. They wanted Anglo-Americans to stay off the Edwards Plateau. And then once the buffalo stopped coming down into the Edwards Plateau, then suddenly they were less interested in defending it, and that's when they write they sign a treaty with the Germans in 1847. So I'm really addressing the second part. The first part was, Texas was popular. Texas was a magnet for people because the land was so cheap. It was a fraction of the price of land in the United States. And you could really get rich by acquiring these massive parcels of land that they were giving away. So it was a very attractive destination if you were from the lower South. I think I answered both of them. Yeah.
Yes. What about the 1968 Hemisphere and the study that was done on Texas cultures?
Okay.
Did that bring any research to you?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Did that bring research to you, and what insights would those have been?
I've been to the Institute of Texas Cultures, and I think it's important. But I have to say, for all the good work that they do there, it hasn't really made its way into the scholarship or into the pedagogy that we're teaching seventh graders. I think sometimes we pay lip service to that. We say, yes, there are other people here, and yes, let's talk about Native Americans, and let's talk about Anglo-Americans, and so on. But there's still, I think, this impulse to create, I hate to use it, a meta-narrative. There is still this attempt, I think, to create this narrative that we can all be a part of. And one of the things that I learned, and from other scholarship that I've done, is that Texas is a very, very violent place. And there's a lot of inter-ethnic violence. And I'm not really sure why we need to try to find this overarching narrative that we can all agree on. I think Texas, in many ways, is a brutal place, it's a violent place, and many ethnic groups are fighting other ethnic groups, and we should just simply acknowledge that. So that's kind of the way I see it.
Can you yell it out?
Is there a picture of the Texas government structure before the revolution, or was that the absence of that because of the revolution?
Okay. Wow. Thanks for asking that at 7:58. So the causes of the revolution are really complex. And maybe, how many of you have heard of Forget the Alamo, the book that came out a couple of years ago, which was very, very controversial? And the Forget the Alamo people said, well, it was all about slavery, slavery, slavery. My book's about race, and so you would think that, well, surely I would say the same thing. I actually think it's about land. And I know that people are using land for cotton, but they're using it for other things too. And I've alluded to this in my talk, and that is that land speculation is really how you got rich. In an age before mechanized agriculture, 4,600 acres was, you were never putting that into cultivation. And so they wanted to speculate in land. And so that's what they wanted. They wanted economic opportunities. As far as the political structure that you're referring to, the Mexican government pretty much left them alone. I argue in the book that they really didn't know much about what was going on in Mexico City. I'm not saying they hadn't heard of Santa Anna, but what did his coup d'etat really mean? They really didn't know, and they really didn't think about it. What is the catalyst for the revolution is the sudden arrival of large numbers of troops in the summer of 35. And why are those troops being sent there? Because Zavala's here, to go back to my earlier point. So I don't really see it as a political, wow, I can't believe I did this in 2 minutes. I don't see it as a political problem, but more of an economic one. If you really want to understand the big picture in the Texas Revolution, you need to look at the economic world that these people inhabit. That was a better answer than my other two.
Pretty good. Well, thanks, Sam Haynes. This has been fabulous. He will be upstairs in just a moment. If you really want a book, you better go up there and get it now. He'll be signing books up there. Next week, Rebecca Blackwood is going to bring us a girl named Carrie, Carrie Marcus, and her untold story of Neiman Marcus and the part she played in it. It's a fabulous Dallas story. So see you upstairs.